Buchanan contends that mistakes in British diplomacy, especially those by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, resulted in the world wars and the demise of the British Empire. The program, taped at Mr. Buchanan's home, is an hour.
Pat Buchanan, how would you describe Winston Churchill?
Winston Churchill was a great man, one of the greatest of the century, a man of extraordinary accomplishments and extraordinary capacities and abilities, but of an incurably flawed judgment. And I think Winston Churchill, for all his triumphs and successes, was probably the man most responsible for the early and rapid collapse of the British Empire. I think some of his judgments were colossally wrong, some of them were right, and I do believe he's probably one of the most extraordinary men who ever lived.
Expand on why you think he is responsible for the collapse of the British Empire.
I think what brought the British Empire down as rapidly as it did and as terribly as it did was World War II. In my judgment, World War II was exactly what Churchill called it, the unnecessary war. And the fatal blunder, as I describe it in my book, was the decision in panic of the British government after Czechoslovakia fell apart in 1939, March, to give an unsolicited war guarantee to a collection of Polish colonels who had a romantic view of their own warlike capacities, who had participated in the breakup of Czechoslovakia. And Britain gave this war guarantee unsolicited to back the Poles in a cause, control of Danzig, where they thought the Germans were fundamentally right. And that war guarantee, which stiffened the Polish spine, gave the Poles the backbone to stand up to Hitler, who now had no way out but to take Danzig. Hitler attacked Poland. The British declared war on Germany. That 6-year war brought down the British Empire. And the man who was driving hardest for war with Germany was Winston Churchill.
How would you describe Adolf Hitler?
Hitler is clearly a satanic figure in terms of what he did, and an evil man, an amoral man, a Darwinian, who called himself a barbarian. But Hitler, as a statesman, his objectives and foreign policy and geostrategic policy was in some ways more conservative, less ambitious than that of the Kaiser. Hitler had been in World War I. He had fought for 4 years, and he'd come out of that war with these lessons learned. One was, we made a fatal mistake going to a true front war with Russia and the Atlantic powers. The Americans and the British, as soon as we went to war with them, because they're great sea powers, they cut off all our colonies. Our colonies were hostages. We lost them all instantly. We can't defeat the British and the Americans. Secondly, the British are our natural ally. Even in Mein Kampf, he says, the British, they're a commercial power and a world power with all their colonies. We have no quarrel with the British. And therefore, they and the Italians are our natural allies. And to keep the British, friendly or neutral or allied meant that Hitler had to give up any ambitions to take back Alsace-Lorraine or the small territories he had lost to Belgium or Denmark. He wrote those off, and he wrote off the South Tyrol to Italy because he wanted an ally in Italy. What he wanted was peace or indifference in the West, and to create around himself a number of basically satellite allied nations that would make Germany the dominant power in Central and Eastern Europe. And if there was one nation he wanted to go after and destroy, it was the Bolshevik regime in the Soviet Union.
And in fact, in your book, you quote Mein Kampf saying that he wanted to go east and not
He
west.
wanted to go east, and he made this decision. Other historians of Kershaw says the same thing, who wrote the last 2 very good books on Hitler and his ambitions, was that Hitler's ambitions were in the East, and maybe only, some believe, only in the East. My view is I'm not even sure Hitler wanted a war with the Soviet Union. Clearly, as I demonstrate in the book from Hitler's own statements, he wanted the Polish Danzig question in the corridor settled not by force, he told his generals and diplomats. And that's understandable given what he demanded. What did he demand? A Nazi flag over a German flag over Danzig, a town of 350,000. Political control for the Germans, let the Poles keep economic control. He didn't demand the Polish corridor back, and if he wanted war with Poland, that's what he would have demanded. He demanded a quarter-mile rail and road corridor across the Polish corridor between Prussia and Germany, which had been separated foolishly at Versailles by giving Poland this strip of German land between them. He never wanted war with Britain, and he never wanted a world war.
But September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland.
He invaded Poland because...
Militarily.
Militarily, because why did he invade Poland? On the 26th of March, he said, I don't want this issue settled by force with Poland. Why? He wanted Poland as an ally. He had an agreement with Pilsudski, who died in 1935. He liked Pilsudski. These people were right-wing neo-fascists. And Hitler liked the regime. And what he wanted from the regime, he thought the regime was a natural ally, just like Mussolini, just like Admiral Horthy, just like General Franco, just like the Monsignor Tiso in Slovakia. These were right-wingers he thought are natural allies, and in return for giving him Danzig back and a rail and road corridor, he wanted them in the anti-Comintern pact that he was pulling together of Germany, Italy, Japan, against Moscow, the Soviet Union, Judeo-Bolshevism, as he called it. And so that's what he wanted. But when the Brits gave the war guarantee on the 31st, Hitler went berserk. In 2 days, he ordered Case White, and that is preparations for an invasion of Poland as of September 1, at the latest. But then he kept making offers to Poland. He still wanted to deal with the Poles. He didn't want war. And then the British, of course, and the French are in Moscow trying to cut a deal with Stalin. And so Hitler's watching this. And the Poles refuse even to talk to him about Danzig. And Henderson, the British ambassador, says, why wasn't I told of the generosity of Hitler's offer of April 25th? So Hitler is increasingly frustrated. He's going to be forced to back down. So he says, the Poles have joined the West against me. So he forms an alliance with Stalin. Even that, I think, was not designed necessarily for war. It was designed diplomatically to get the Brits out. And what he did, that was on the 23rd or 24th of August. And so Neville Chamberlain's still prime minister. So Chamberlain, what does he do? When Hitler announces this Hitler-Stalin pact, Hitler thinks that this brilliant pact, we got the Soviets on our side and we're there, and clearly Poland's going to be divided again and the Brits can't do anything about it. They're not going to stand up behind their guarantee. The 24th, Chamberlain reissues the guarantee to Poland and forms a military alliance with Poland. What did Hitler do? He backed down. He called off the invasion for the 25th. And he tried to find a way, all during that week, that period, to get some kind of deal with the Poles, which would at least, or some kind of offer to the Poles, which would convince the British to say, look, Poland, you got to deal with Germany or we're not going to stand by the guarantee. So ultimately, when you see Hitler in his own interpreter, when the British hand the ultimatum in, and Henderson takes it into Ribbentrop, who takes it into Hitler. Hitler is, they just say his face was a mask of rage. He looked at Ribbentrop and he said, what now? And what he meant, I think, was our diplomacy has failed, because he never wanted war with the British Empire. He, of all the leaders, take FDR, Churchill, Stalin, Mussolini, all the others, of all the leaders, Hitler was a greater admirer of the British Empire than any of them, except Winston Churchill.
Pat Buchanan, are you suggesting that Poland should have been sacrificed to prevent World War II?
No, I'm not suggesting Poland should have been sacrificed. What I am saying is, as of 1930, first, the Polish corridor and Danzig were not worth a war by Great Britain. Secondly, Great Britain could not defend the corridor and Danzig. Third, they had no plans to defend Danzig and the corridor. Fourth, they thought the Germans were right on the issue. What I'm saying is they should never have issued the war guarantee to Poland. They should have told the Poles the truth. We can't defend you, and there's no way we can defeat Germany in the amount of time it's going to take them to defeat you. You've got to decide this yourselves. What the British should have done, and the French, after the collapse of Czechoslovakia, is exactly what I wrote in a book, Republic Not an Empire, and George Kennan agreed with me. And what it is draw a line across the Low Countries and across the front of France, a red line, and tell Hitler if he crosses it, he's at war with Great Britain and France. Hitler would never have crossed the line. That is what the Americans did. When Stalin had control of all of Eastern Europe, we didn't say you've got to get out of Poland, or if you move into Hungary, as they did in '56, you're at war. We said if you cross the Elbe River, you're at war with NATO and the United States, and Stalin didn't cross it. That is what I'm saying, that Hitler didn't want war with Poland, he didn't want war with Britain, and had there been no guarantee, no war guarantee, there would have been no war in the West, in my judgment. And frankly, all the people, all the Jewish people and Christian people of Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, France, Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece, would have survived the war. There would have been no war in the West. That's what I believe.
When did Winston Churchill become Prime Minister?
He became Prime Minister in the 10th of May, 1940. And he became Prime Minister as a result of the Norway debacle, where the First Lord of the Admiralty, who happened to be Winston Churchill, plotted a British move into neutral Norway to violate their neutrality, to seize the Norwegian ports, which were being used by the Germans, who were transshipping iron ore from Sweden through Norway and down the coast because the Swedish ports were frozen in the winter. Churchill had this plan to violate the neutrality of Norway, but he foolishly leaked it to some military aides, and word got to Hitler. Hitler wanted to keep Norway neutral. It was just what he wanted, because he had a great benefit, Norway and Denmark. So Hitler said, in effect, the British are going to move in there and we got to move first. And so Admiral Raeder and his troops, some of whom were planted in the holds of merchant ships, they were all moved into Norway, and they took it a day before the British Marines arrived. And they took all the ports. And this debacle, Lloyd George called it one of a series of debacles, which was Churchill's responsibility, caused the collapse of Chamberlain's government. And who rose to power? Winston Churchill, the architect of the disaster. It is an amazing story. I mean, the man did have great luck.
But weren't the British invited by the King of Norway?
No, the British were planning an invasion of Norway was neutral. The British were planning to move into it directly and violate its neutrality. This is what is so funny about, not funny, but it's so paradoxical about World War I. You know, Churchill persuaded Lloyd George, or helped persuade him. I think Lloyd George was going to stay with the war party anyhow, because he was an opportunist and he knew if he went against it, he'd be out. But Churchill persuaded Lloyd George, said, stay with us until we find out how the Germans come through into France in World War I. This is August 19, Guns of August 1914. Because Churchill knew that the German army had to come through Belgium. And that Churchill and the others, a horrible thing they've done, violated the neutrality of Belgium. Churchill was planning to violate the neutrality of Belgium himself by blockading Belgian ports if the Germans hadn't violated it first.
Well, in your new book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, you trace the origins of World War II back to World War I and prior to World War I, which is not necessarily new information, but Germany invaded Belgium first.
Oh yeah, there's no question.
Before any...
Oh, I don't deny that. Germany violated Belgian neutrality, and look, Germany made enormous blunders in World War I.
And this is back in 1913.
1913, 1914. I don't exonerate the Germans of all responsibility, and even at Versailles, they said, we do not say we are not partly responsible for this war, but we do not bear full moral culpability for it. The great blunder of the Germans was to give the Kaiser a war guarantee. This is one of the keys to my book, a blank check to Austria to punish the Serbs who had assassinated their Archduke. And the Austrians were right. The assassination of the Archduke was by a fanatic, but he had ties to Serbian intelligence, clearly ties to the top of Serbian intelligence. And the Austrians took the blank check and held it for 4 weeks before they issued the ultimatum to Serbia. If they had moved right away, all of Europe would have understood, but they held it for 4 weeks until the Russians got into the idea that this is they're moving on Serbia, our little brothers, our allies. And the Kaiser, at the end of this process, in late July, he was desperate to try to pull it back. So was the Tsar, so was King George V. So, quite frankly, were all the monarchs of Europe. Franz Joseph were trying to pull back, but there were very hard men in every camp. And the hardest of them all in England was Winston Spencer Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. Sir Edward Grey had committed Britain secretly to war for France in any event, even if the Germans had not gone through Belgium. But the one who was really just disconsolate when he thought Sir Edward Grey might pull together a meeting of ambassadors and avert war was Winston Churchill.
Okay. You've mentioned a couple names here. Who is David Lloyd George?
Lloyd George is probably, certainly he's one of the two greatest prime ministers of the 20th century. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the putative or successor to Asquith, who was prime minister in 1914. And Lloyd George is an incredible character. In the Boer War, he had been an anti-war liberal, and he had been crucified for it. And his party had taken a terrible beating. But he was a great hero. He's an extraordinarily talented man. He's not up to Churchill's level in terms of Churchill as a writer, but as a politician, he was in many ways superior. He could bring people together. And in the middle of World War I, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Asquith government fell, and he came into power in 1916 and formed a coalition government with the Tories, and he led the British to victory in World War I. He represented the British Empire at the Versailles Conference, and objective observers said even Lord Kane said, Lloyd George was head and shoulders above any of the other Allied leaders, basically Clemenceau and Wilson and Orlando. And he came home from Versailles the big winner. All the German ships were given to him, even though they committed suicide at Scapa Flow. He had the German merchant fleet. He had the underseas cables. He had new colonies in Africa. He had the parts of the Ottoman Empire. He had parts of the British Empire, the German Empire in the South Pacific. He had all these reparations. He made the Germans pay reparations for pensions of the British soldiers, because Great Britain had been unharmed, and so the French would have gotten all the reparations because it was torn to pieces, Northwest. And so he said, no, we got to include pensions in there. And Wilson, to convince Wilson, who hated him, Wilson just hated Lloyd George. Lloyd George got Smuts, the ambassador of South Africa, or not the ambassador, the prime minister, Jan Smuts. And he went and convinced Wilson. And so Wilson signed on to the pensions, and the Americans, who were very honorable at that conference and idealistic, who wanted an honorable peace, they were sickened and enraged with Woodrow Wilson. Sickened and enraged.
Self-determination. Woodrow Wilson's self-determination, you talk about that.
Wilson got into the war after he'd won an election in 1916. His party ran on the platform, he kept us out of war. And what happened was, no one's trying to exonerate the Kaiser and the German General Staff of responsibility, their responsibility for the war. What the Kaiser had done was, the Germans, and again, Churchill, had imposed a starvation blockade on Germany, a high seas blockade rather than a close-in blockade. These were violations of international norms of conduct in warfare. You didn't starve women and children. Lord Salisbury said, we're not going to do that to the Boers. If the food's going to the women and children and families, we got to let it go through. We'll stop it if it's going to their army. But Churchill imposed the starvation blockade on Germany, so the Germans retaliated with submarines. But the submarines sank the Lusitania off the Irish coast in April 1915. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what Churchill did. Did he put it in the way of the Germans? 128 Americans were killed, 1,000 people. And Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and a lot of the Americans were demanding, get into the war. And I give Wilson credit. He stayed out of the war, but they did warn the Germans. And so the Germans called off this unrestricted submarine warfare. But what happened, you're getting to 1917 now, and the German General Staff meets with the Kaiser. And they met with him and said, look, the Americans, if we begin submarine warfare, the Americans are liable to come in, but the Americans are unarmed. They got 17th largest army in the world. They're sitting on the other side of the Atlantic. There's no more harm they can do to us than they're doing now. They're shipping all this stuff to the Brits. Give us 6 months with these submarines and we'll knock the Brits out of the war, they told the Kaiser. And the Kaiser okayed it. And the German Prime Minister, Bethmann Hollweg, he tried to convince otherwise, but he said, I can't argue with the generals and admirals. And as they all walked out of the room, he said, Finis Germaniae, the end of Germany. And that's what happened. The British held the Germans, and they held them in the offensive of 1918, Ludendorff's final great offensive that reached the Marne. And the Americans, frankly, won the war. They were the decisive force. By the spring and summer of 1918, 250,000 American troops a month were pouring into the lines. The German lines were breaking, their morale was down, the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted out of the war, and so that's when the Germans sued for peace. And that's the beginning of a lot of the problems. See, the Germans had won the war against Russia, and they won the war against Romania, and they had imposed a peace on the Russian Empire, on Lenin's empire, which was in the interest of the West. They had torn Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, all these countries out of Lenin's empire and set them free. And so to get back to the fundamental point, what I'm getting at is, it was the Kaiser's ambitions were global. He had a world policy. He had a world fleet, the high seas fleet. He had colonies around the world. He wanted to be treated on a par with Great Britain. And one of the causes of the war was, of course, his own mindset and the fact that the British treated him with such contempt.
Sir Edward Grey, who is he?
Sir Edward Grey is the foreign minister of Great Britain for 10 years, who is probably the man most responsible for Britain's entry into World War I, because it was he who told Haldane, or approved Haldane's plan for secret military talks with France following up on their Entente of 1904, which was designed to solve their colonial quarrels. In Egypt, the French had claims on the canal, and in Morocco, the British had claims there. They traded them off, and that was to settle colonial quarrels. And Sir Edward Grey and Haldane got together and said, let's start secret military talks to commit the British to send an army of 115,000 troops to France within 2 weeks of a war with Germany if it happens. This is almost 10 years before the war, 1905, January 1906. And frankly, it was the arrival of the British Expeditionary Force, the greatest little army in the world, that stopped the German army on its big sweep through Belgium, which was going to come around and encircle the French. One German general, the German generals thought the British were firing machine guns. So effective were their riflemen from what they had learned in the Boer War. They could open and fire those guns perfectly, 15 rounds a minute. And all of these soldiers, they were colonial soldiers, and it was a tiny army. But it was, I think, man for man at that point, the finest army in the world, and it stopped the German invasion of France.
Pat Buchanan, you tell the story about July 1914, a regatta, or
this was June 1914.
June 1914, in a regatta in Germany.
Sure.
And what happened then?
Well, what was wonderful about this was the Germans had challenged the British with a high seas fleet. They were building a great fleet in their Kiel in Wilhelmshaven. And this enormous fleet they were building was to rival the British fleet, and the Kaiser was responsible. And they kept building it up, and von Tirpitz was the architect of it. He came in 1896 under the Kaiser. And they wanted to challenge the British fleet. And they said, in the event of war, we want to be able to do so much damage to them, the Brits won't fight us. And of course, this made the British understandably paranoid. In the Baltic Sea, 400 miles away, is the greatest fleet on earth besides their own. So they bring all these warships home from the rest of the world. And that's what brought the Brits into alliance with Russia and France, who were their colonial rivals. So it was a stupid thing. But in 1913, Tirpitz gave it up. His rival incidentally, was the First Lord of the Admiralty then, young Winston Churchill. And so the Germans were building dreadnought for dreadnought almost until they gave up. In 1913, Tirpitz said, we will accept 60% of the British Royal Navy. and we can't compete with the British and keep up our army and protect ourselves from the Russians who are building up in Poland, which was part of Russia then, and the French army, which is the finest in the world. So they stopped, and so the Kaiser was Queen Victoria's grandson. He regularly used to come over to England and race, and he won a race there, and his uncle, Edward VII, detested the Kaiser. He was Willie. He had no respect for his nephew. And Willie came over and won a regatta over there. And I think Edward never again went to one of those regattas. But what they were having, and this is late June 1914. The British Navy sends over this mighty squadron with the King George V, their brand new battleships, Ajax and all these dreadnoughts. They go into the harbor. The Tirpitz takes them aboard, the finest German battleships. The Kaiser gets on his uniform of the British Admiralty, visits George V. They're having parties. Prince Henry brings the British officers in. They're meeting the girls. It's a wonderful time. And they're having their regatta. And a boat on the 28th or 29th, right around then, sails out, a small boat, to the Kaiser's ship. He's racing on his Meteor. It's the name of his boat. And says they've assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand, who was a great friend of the Kaiser's, and whom the Kaiser looked forward to seeing run the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph was probably in his 80s. He had been in since 1848. And so the Kaiser, everything appalled, went over it. And the British, of course, got on their warships, and the regatta was closed down, and the British and the Germans sent the signal, safe voyage home to England. And the British warship, I believe, sent back the signal, friends now, friends in future, friends forever. And these were the two greatest navies on earth. And that's the situation when the Archduke was assassinated. 6 weeks later, the two countries are slaughtering each other in the fields of France. Unbelievable. Or 6-8 weeks later.
What was the Schlieffen Plan?
The Schlieffen Plan was, he's one of the more interesting characters in history. Count von Schlieffen took over the German General Staff in 1896. One of the previous leaders of it had been the great von Moltke, who believed, they had trouble with France and Russia, that if war came, the Germans should adopt a defensive posture and and defend what they had, and let the enemy, they said, commit suicide on German steel. Von Schlieffen said the only way, the strategic doctrine of the German General Staff is this: wherever a crisis occurs and war is imminent, we are going to be at war with both Russia and France. And the most powerful of our enemies and the most capable is the French army. The Russian army, while enormous, will take a long period of time. They don't have the railroads. And so what we have to do, no matter where the war begins, we have got to go through and kill France in 6 or 8 weeks, and kill the French army, and then put the German army on trains to meet the Russian steamroller, which will be rolling into Prussia. And this was dogma, doctrine in the German General Staff. And they had all the timetables, all the horses, all the locomotives where everybody reported. It was a gigantically enormous, complex plan. But to make it work, Schlieffen looked at the French forts at Epinal, Verdun was one, Toul or others. These were tremendous French forts that were just east of Alsace-Lorraine. And the Germans said, if we send our army in there, it'll be cut to pieces by these defensive positions. So how can we get into France? And the answer was Belgium. Belgium is neutral. So the Germans, Schlieffen said, we put 1/4 of our army, or 1/7 of our army, 1/8 of it down on Alsace-Lorraine, because the French will try to take back Alsace-Lorraine. Their army will sweep in the south there, and what we want is a holding force to back up. Meantime, 7/8 of our army will sweep through northern Belgium and will come around, because it'll be undefended, because Belgium's neutral, there's no French army there, come around behind Paris, behind the French army, and take them from the rear. And of course, the key here was this violated the neutrality of Belgium, which Prussia, and which France and everybody had agreed to, 1939, was a vital interest of Britain, and each country had a right to protect it, had a right, not an obligation. So that was the von Schlieffen plan. And so when all the troubles occurred in Serbia and Austria, And the Austrians rejected Serbs, who agreed to 9 of their 10 demands. The Austrians rejected it, sent an ultimatum, declared war. This is in late July. The Russians began to move to defend the Serbs and began to mobilize their entire army. The Kaiser said, for God's sakes, Nicky, to the Tsar, demobilize. The Tsar didn't do it. The German General Staff put into effect the Schlieffen Plan, and the trains began to roll. And that set it off. As one of the historians who's very good, he said von Schlieffen had died in 1913, but he said the dead hand of Count von Schlieffen pulled the trigger that started the First World War. It's a remarkable story. Schlieffen is an unbelievable creature. He was in a motor car or a carriage, and they were going across Belgium and these places before the war. He's scouting it all out. And one of his officers said, my goodness, what a beautiful stream that is. And Schlieffen looked up and looked out and said, an insignificant obstacle, and moved right on. He was I mean, some of these figures in this history, German and British alike, are just extraordinary figures, and you understand, frankly, how some of them, they seem just so much superior to some of the folks we run into these days. I mean, whether you agreed with them or like them or dislike them, they're extraordinary men.
The period between the wars, you talk about several of the treaties and Britain's attitude toward continental Europe. What are some of the treaties that, in your view, led to or the breaking of treaties that led to World War II, such as the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, the rescission of that, the Locarno Treaty?
Locarno Pact, right?
Locarno Pact. How did that lead into World War II?
Well, the seeds of World War II were planted at Versailles when the Germans had surrendered on Wilson's 14 points. They said, we accept the 14 points, and it goes to your question, the right of self-determination. And so the Germans agreed that they were going to lose Alsace-Lorraine, that they were going to have to vacate Belgium. That was in there, that the Poland needed a corridor to the sea. There would be an independent Poland. They had no problem with that. And so there's a number of things the Germans agreed to, but what happened is when they got to Versailles, the Germans weren't even invited to sit in, and they were handed this agreement which basically tore Germany to pieces, tore the Austro-Hungarian Empire apart. Not only that, but put Austrian Germans under Italian rule, gave all these people got huge land grabs from it, the British, the French, but basically Hungary was torn to pieces. It lost its lands to the new Czechoslovakia. But the key thing was what was done to Germany, and not done in the West, because I think the Germans accepted their losses in the West. What was done by, first they put the Sudeten Germans, or German Bohemian Germans, put 3.5 million of them underneath Czech rule. They didn't give them any right of self-determination. They had no right to do that. They put the Slovaks under Czech rule, the Ruthenians under Czech rule. They put 500,000 or 100,000 Poles and 800,000 Hungarians all under Czech rule, and made it Czechoslovakia the 10th largest industrial nation in the world. They set the stage for a future crisis. They took Silesia, even the part that voted to stay with Germany, and gave that to Poland. And then they gave the city of Danzig to Poland, or rather made it a free city under the League of Nations, but Polish control. Then Memel, the Lithuanians came in and stole the German city of Memel. And so what the Germans did, they were divided, they were dismembered, they were given unpayable debts, all their colonies, which they said would be equally, we will have a fair settlement. They stole everything from their colonies. All the German private property, homes, were taken. The German rivers were internationalized. Germany was denied the right to free trade in other countries, but every country could sell into Germany. And it was just it was a humiliation and a disgrace and a dishonoring of what Wilson had promised, and a dishonoring of all the things that had been promised in the peace negotiations at the beginning, at the end of the war. And they declared the Kaiser a war criminal. And then they made the Germans sign total moral responsibility for everything that happened in the war, and forced him to do that. And they said, if you don't sign the treaty, Marshal Foch will march to Berlin with Americans and British and French troops, and the Czechs and the Poles will march in, and we'll continue the starvation blockade, which continued after the war, after the armistice. The Allies, with American ships participating, the Brits, continued to starve the German people, wouldn't let them fish in the Baltic Sea, till finally one courageous British general wrote at Paris, he said, look, My men, morale is being destroyed by watching little kids go through garbage and try to find food. And so we did this after they had laid down their arms. And so the Germans were completely embittered. And 1,000 times Adolf Hitler gave a speech which was simply titled The Treaty of Versailles.
What about some of the treaties in the 20s and 30s?
Well, now you go to the British end of it. That was an act of criminal. Thank God you had the Lodge and those people who did not sign the Treaty of Versailles and did not ratify it in the Senate, because Americans would have been required to enforce this horribly unjust, dishonorable peace the Allies had imposed and Wilson had brought home. Thank God they kept us out of there. Now come the British blunders. The British start to get guilty feelings. But the first one was a result of guilty feelings. They're in debt to the Americans. So the Americans, Harding and Heavens Hughes, the Secretary of State, they tell the British, look, we're going to have a Washington Naval Conference and we want you to break your treaty with Japan. The British had a 20-year treaty with Japan. The Japanese had been completely loyal, had gobbled up all the German colonies in the Far East, had escorted British warships, British troops, Anzac troops to Gallipoli. And the Japanese had been loyal and faithful. The Americans said, give it up. And so the Brits had a huge battle over it. And what happened was Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, said, we're going to have the Americans tell us what to do. We'll give up our treaty with Japan if you sign a treaty with us, you Americans, to protect our colonies, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, all the rest, from the Japanese. Because if we insult and isolate Japan like that, we're going to make them an enemy. And the Americans offered them nothing. And the British, Churchill behind it, broke their treaty with Japan. Utter folly. That's the first blunder.
And what was the result of that, though?
Well, the result of that was the alienization and the isolation of Japan. What is Japan now? The Americans hate them. And the Americans, they thought, were racist about the Japanese. They weren't entirely wrong. And they lost the British as an ally. They got nationalist Chinese in China. China is rising and is very anti-Japanese because of the Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s. And in Russia, they're facing this monstrous Bolshevik regime, which is encroaching on China and Manchuria. And so the result of that was that the Japanese said, we've got to carve out an area in China as a defense, as a buffer state. And that's why the Japanese moved into Manchuria. They wanted to create a buffer state in China, and frankly, they now detested the West, and they also wanted to make the China the way the British had India. We dump all our products here, and they produce for us, and that's our great colony. And so that is the reason the Japanese began to move in there. And if the British had not broken that alliance with the Japanese in 1931, when the Japanese moved into Manchuria, the British could have done what they did with the French. Okay, North China's your sphere of influence, South China's ours. The Japanese would have said fine. So the next thing you come to is the Locarno Pact. The Locarno Pact was an excellent pact. It was done by Austin Chamberlain, the half-brother of Joseph Chamberlain, but the Germans were behind it. The French were demanding that the Brits give them a guarantee that they would come to war and defend them in case the Germans crossed the frontier. So the Germans came back and said, okay, that's a good idea, but give us a guarantee that if the French cross our frontier, you'll fight on our side. And so Italy, Mussolini, and Britain gave the guarantee that the Rhineland would be permanently demilitarized, as it had been at Versailles, and secondly, that Britain and Italy would guarantee the frontier of the two countries. And the two countries signed it. And the Germans had a democratic regime at the time, and it was very pro-Western and a very anti-Bolshevik.
1935?
This is 1925. 26. And Austin Chamberlain and the German foreign minister got the Nobel Prize both. And so then you come back to what happens during the Germans in 1931 during the Depression. They ask if we can have a free trade agreement with Austria, our Austrian allies. And they go to the League of Nations because they had to get permission. And the British, French, and Czechs veto it. And so the Austrian bank collapses. And the German government, Brüning and the others say, look, if you don't give us some victories, political and diplomatic victories here, you're going to get the Nazis. Well, I'll be the last. One of them said, I'm going to be the last democratic chancellor of Germany if you allies will not give us any victories, any diplomatic, political, economic victories. And so the Brits wouldn't do it. And so Hitler rises to power. And so Hitler rises to power, and his ideal alliances, as I said, are Britain and they are Italy. And he's a great admirer of Il Duce's. I mean, he was just the Nazi leader. He wrote to Il Duce through the Italian Chamber of Commerce in Berlin. He said, "I'd like an autographed photo of Il Duce." And Mussolini wrote across it, "Denied." Mussolini despised Hitler. He thought Hitler was a clown. Hitler made his first foreign trip. He shows up in Venice
as chancellor.
As chancellor, it's 1934, and von Neurath, as foreign minister, says, "What you want to do is you want to dress up in civilian clothes." He's got this silly hat on, and this raincoat, and this other coat, and his striped pants and everything. And he shows up, and Mussolini is in there in this resplendent outfit, and so Mussolini tells Ciano and his son-in-law and his other diplomats, he says, "You know, what a clown this Hitler is." And then Hitler apparently came in and starts talking to him about Mein Kampf. And Mussolini said, "You know, he's talking about this book, this stupid book I've never had a chance to read." And then Hitler starts talking about the allegedly racial Negroid traits in Mediterranean people, like Italians. So it was just a horrendous meeting. And Mussolini's laughing at this clown. But that summer, what happens is, the first thing is Hitler conducts the Rome Purge of the SA, which had millions of members, and the German army, which was only 100,000 strong, or maybe secretly was larger. The German army tells to Hitler, said, "Look, you want our support and allegiance, you got to get rid of this thing, this monstrous SA. It's a rival to the army." And Rome is becoming a counter force, and Rome was Ernst Röhm. He was a homosexual, but he was a war hero. And he wanted a second revolution, in other words, completing the revolution, and he was very much a socialist, very much on the left. And so Hitler decided against Rome was getting too big for his britches. So he flew down there and personally led the purge of Rome, where they put him, they caught them all in homosexual trysts, and they put him in the penitentiary, and they were shooting them left and right. They killed two of them, or they killed about 200 of the SA leaders. I mean, they were a vicious bunch. But at the time, the SS took the opportunity to kill a former prime minister and his wife, and to try to kill Franz von Papen, whom they didn't kill. But then what happens here after that is, that just stunned Mussolini. He said, "These people are complete barbarians." And what happened after that was the coup by local Nazis in Vienna, where local Nazis, probably not with the knowledge of Hitler, people don't know, but walked in and assassinated Dollfuss, who was a Catholic, conservative, very hardliner, anti-Nazi. They assassinated him, and at that, Mussolini sent 4 divisions up the Brenner Pass, to the Brenner Pass, and threatened to intervene if the Germans intervened. And he called the British and French to Stresa, which is in the northern part of Italy. It's on one of the lakes up there. And he said, "We got to form a Stresa front. Britain, France, and Germany, and Italy, if the Germans make another move in violation of Versailles, we have to act together and stop them." He was strongly anti-Nazi. He thought Hitler was a degenerate, a sexual degenerate, he said, and these people are out of the woods. These are not fascists. These Nazis are a different breed altogether. I mean, we have ideas rooted in the Roman past and family and tradition. And these people are a different type. And he was the hardest driving force for an alliance of Britain, France, and Italy to stop Adolf Hitler.
So, Pat Buchanan, in your view, how do you get from that point to the Mussolini-Hitler alliance?
Well, you get very simple. Mussolini, in the Stresa front, the agreement said, "We're going to act together against any threat in Europe." And Mussolini put the words "in Europe" because he had plans then to move into Ethiopia because of an incident on the border where Italians were attacked, I believe, by huge, massive Ethiopian troops at Walwal. And in 1896, the Italians had been defeated at Adwa by the Ethiopian forces. They called it Abyssinia. And the Italian prisoners had been just carved up, just mutilated. It was horrible what was done to them. And Mussolini wanted Ethiopia, or he at least wanted the plains of the Ogaden in Ethiopia. And he thought that the British and French, who, after all, had an awful lot of empire, the Brits had all the way down the. Oh, you could walk all the way from Cairo down to Cape Town without leaving a British imperial territory. Mussolini thought they would smile and let him take Ethiopia, and instead, the British and French are on their high horse, their League of Nations morality. They impose sanctions on him, and they get the League of Nations to impose sanctions on him. But the sanctions are too weak to drive him out of Ethiopia, but they're strong enough to antagonize and alienate him, and they drove Mussolini straight into the arms of a man he had hated, Adolf Hitler, and out of that came the Pact of Steel and the Hitler-Mussolini, the Axis. And that was another blunder by the British and French that led directly to World War II.
Jonah Goldberg, National Review Online, writes this about your newest book. Buchanan claims to be a man of abstract foreign policy rules. In his case, the notion that we must act from objective national interest. As a result, he has earned a strange new respect among anti-war liberals, self-described realists, for his opposition to the war in Iraq in recent years. He is a man of principle, we've been told. In reality, Buchanan is a wonderful example of how those who claim to follow a strict set of abstract foreign policy rules are often just disguising their own biases. A strict and objective application of our national interest isn't the principle he's upholding. No cold pragmatist he. Buchanan's not following anything here other than the loyalties of his own heart.
You mean, I don't know exactly what he's referring to. I'm talking here, basically, about the vital national interest of the British Empire at each point in this process. It seemed to me at Versailles, even though it's very difficult for them at Versailles, given passions that had been aroused by the horrors in the war, to impose a just peace, they should have corrected the errors of Versailles in Britain's own interest, in France's own interest, when they had a democratic Germany. As you move through each of these things, the British should have acted in their own interest and told the Americans, we will break our alliance with Japan if you will give us an alliance. They didn't do that. They broke the alliance with Japan. They caved into the Americans. They capitulated. They appeased the Americans. That was a mistake. With regard to Ethiopia, with regard to Mussolini, and Kissinger agrees here with me, and everybody else does. Churchill eventually does. And Churchill even did at the time. He said, I'm very worried about breaking it up with Italy, which has been a longtime friend of ours, over Ethiopia, which is, nobody can say that it's a modern nation or an advanced civilized nation. Why are we destroying our relationship with the Italians over this colony, over Ethiopia, which we don't care about, when the vital thing is the Germans and we want the alliance with Italy? This is the standpoint of all these decisions, is British vital national interests. As I said, the war guarantee was an act of folly because Britain had no vital interest in Eastern Europe, had no interest at all in who controlled Danzig or the corridor, and yet they put the British Empire on the line to go to war on behalf of Poland in a cause in which they disbelieved, and in a war they could not win in Eastern Europe, where they had never fought before. Why in heaven's name would you do that? And the answer, of course, is that Chamberlain did it in panic and hysteria. He had been humiliated by Hitler because Czechoslovakia had fallen apart. He'd been made a fool of. And so, and he's being pushed by his foreign minister, and he's being pushed by Churchill and Attlee and all the rest. So he makes a stupid decision which cost Britain their empire. No, I support the Americans. As I say, we did it right. Our vital interests, quite frankly, were not in Hungary. And so Ike didn't intervene. Our vital interests weren't in Poland in 1953. They weren't in Czechoslovakia in 1968. We didn't go to war. We just drew a line. We said, don't cross that line, because once you get into Western Germany, you're talking about the vital interest of the United States. We did it right. The British did it wrong. That is the entire, or one of the entire points of this book.
Are all wars unnecessary?
No. I mean, the Belgians had no choice in, say, World War I or World War II. They could either fight or lie down. The American Revolutionary War, probably you had to fight to be free of the British Empire. Frankly, the Confederates, if they wanted to be free of the Union, they were going to have to fight Mr. Lincoln's army. So it depends on what your objective is. But an awful lot of wars are unnecessary. The war in Iraq was an unnecessary war. It was a war of choice. We attacked the nation had not attacked us, did not threaten us, did not want war with us, in order to deprive it of weapons it did not have. That is an unnecessary war.
When you hear the term isolationist, what does that mean to you, and do you consider yourself to be one?
Well, isolationist is a pejorative term. It came into real currency around the time of the Spanish-American War, when the new imperialists, like Theodore Roosevelt and the others, after the Spanish-American War, they wanted to acquire, and did acquire, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Hawaiian Islands, and they annexed the Philippine Islands, which turned America from a republic into an empire. And a number of anti-war folks, liberals and conservatives alike in that era, said, this is imperialism. This dishonors our founding fathers. This is taking rule of an alien people whom we have no intention of making American citizens. We are behaving like the other empires of the world. And the people who opposed that were called isolationists. And it was used, frankly, in the 1930s to demonize and smear those like Jack Kennedy, like young Jack Kennedy, young Joe Kennedy, Sergeant Shriver, Gerald Ford, Potter Stewart, who started or supported the America First Committee, which was formed in about August of 1940, I believe, and it was designed to keep the United States out of another bloodbath like the First World War, where everything we went to fight for had been lost when the Allies divided up the whole world. I mean, we went fought to make the war safe for democracy. And these young folks, like Jack Kennedy and others, said, we made it safe for the British Empire, which added 1 million square miles and tens of millions of new subjects. We made it safe for the Japanese Empire. We made it safe for the French Empire. And now we got Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Lenin. So how good a war was that? We don't want another one like it. And they were very patriotic people, and they've been smeared ever since. And I mean, they had 3 presidents, Herbert Hoover, Gerald Ford, and Jack Kennedy, were America Firsters. I mean, are they unpatriotic? And so what the idea, but the isolationist term is false in this sense. Those of us who don't want to get in wars that are none of our business, we don't think we ought to be isolated from the world. Neither did Washington and Jefferson and Adams. They thought we should trade with the entire world. They thought we should have as much commercial intercourse as possible, but stay out of any political alliances. Stay out of alliances which can drag us into war. And one of the great achievements, John Adams, of his life was to sever that war, the 1778 treaty with France, which Washington had danced a jig when he got it because he meant they're going to beat the British. But once they won the war, they said, okay, let's get rid of the French. And they were exactly right. We want you guys helping us, and we'll pay you for it, but once it's done, we don't want any part of the Napoleonic Wars. And John Adams, he ended the naval war with France. We were fighting at sea constantly with them. He ended the naval war with France, and they cut a deal, and what we got out of it was we severed our treaty with France. And so we stayed out of the Napoleonic Wars until Madison and some of the war hawks, some of the neocons of that day, said, look, we can seize Canada. This is great. You know, Wellington's preoccupied here, and the French are going to invade Russia. Let's grab Canada. And so we went into the War of 1812. Now, we had our motives. The Brits were impressing seamen. They were treating us as they usually treated Cousin Jonathan, with contempt. And the Americans were very bellicose folks in those days. But we went up there to grab Canada, too. We had two invasions. Both of them, neither one succeeded. And if it weren't for, frankly, if it weren't for the great Andrew Jackson at New Orleans, the Brits would have torn our country apart.
What do you think would have happened if Great Britain had not declared war on Germany on September 1st, 1939?
I think I don't know what the Poles would have done, whether they would have defied Hitler. Frankly, what the Poles should have done is give him back Danzig. It didn't mean that much to the Poles. Let him have his rail and road corridor, and frankly, and Hitler apparently was willing to compensate with little pieces of land from Slovakia. And so I think there are a number of things could have happened. One, there could have been no war at all, not even a German-Polish war. Secondly, if the Poles resisted, Hitler would probably have taken half of Poland, and maybe would have gotten into the agreement with Russia. Third, there might have been a German, at that point, that's the only way the German-Russian shared a border, was in Poland. You know, they had no border with them, so how are they going to attack them? There could have been a war against Stalin's regime earlier, in which case I think the Germans, even though they weren't as strong, the Germans might have defeated Lenin and hanged the whole crowd in Moscow. And you would have had no Red China, no Gulag archipelago of its size or duration. You would have had no Cold War. And see, I don't think Hitler ever wanted to come west. What did he want in France? What did he want? I mean, when he got to France and took it, then they took back Alsace-Lorraine. But he went to Paris for a couple of days. He went to the Spanish border. He set up his defensive wall there. He didn't demand bases in the Middle East. He didn't demand the French fleet, even though the French and British had demanded the German fleet after World War I. I don't think he wanted anything. What he wanted from the West was, get out of my face. And this is where I want to be a power in Central and Eastern Europe. This is the German sphere of power and influence. And the British have the world empire. And the Americans are predominant in the Western Hemisphere. And the British and the Americans on the seas. And the Japanese in the Far East, we don't care about that. But we are dominant here. I think that's what he wanted, sort of a four-power world like that.
Who is the worst leader, Hitler or Stalin?
Well, I mean, in terms of evil, I think it's evil. You can put Mao Tse-tung in there, Pol Pot. I mean, these people are barbarians. These people deliberately murdered innocent human beings. Hitler in the beginning in the scores and dozens and hundreds, but eventually in the millions. And they fought it. It was a barbaric war between the Germans and Russians. Stalin murdered far more, and I think Mao might have murdered far more than he. But they're all men who believed in that human beings could and should be sacrificed for state aims and aims of power and glory. They're all barbarians. They're all, quite frankly, heretics from the Christian religion. And they imbibe these doctrines, frankly, and they imbibe the doctrines of Darwin, the survival of the fittest and superior races. And there's a great deal of, you take any history you read around 1990s, even Americans, you'll find very racist in the sense, the tribe, the Anglo-Saxon superiority, and the Germans get this Aryan nonsense, and it was Slavic, all these, it was very racist in character. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking of writing a book on all of this, just the power of this, the racial aspect of components. And there was a good piece in Foreign Affairs by this fellow who said that the wars of the 20th century in Europe were all, in effect, race wars in the sense that Churchill talked about the Germanic race and the English race, that it was all, they were wars designed to create new countries where that race would be favored and would have its own culture and its own identity, separate and unique. And of course, these were the things that broke up the Austro-Hungarian. It was a terrific thesis in Foreign Affairs, and as I say, I've thought of writing a book on it.
Are you familiar with Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke?
Oh yeah, I read Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke. I tell you, when I first saw it in the New York Times Review, it was a sick feeling in my stomach, and then I got the book and I got sicker because I said, he's got 15 or 20 quotes in here that are right out of my book that I haven't seen anybody else use. And I'm saying to myself, how paranoid you said, somebody slipped my book to this fellow? But he's the left-wing novelist, and he gets some of those wonderful quotes out there. But where I disagree with Nicholson Baker is he doesn't put them in context, and there's a moral equivalence between statements, say, anti-Semitic statements by Eleanor Roosevelt and anti-Semitic statements by Goebbels and actions, and excuse me, but they're not a parallel. So, but I will say this. It is a terrific and provocative book in this sense, that it introduces people to the idea that this was not all white hats and black hats. And certainly the German regime was guilty of aggressive war, and the Germans started it when they invaded Poland, and the manifest atrocities of Hitler are unpardonable and inexcusable. But good heavens, look at what Stalin, look at that monster we allied ourselves with. As of September 1, 1939, I figured out Hitler's dead, deliberately you can say, from actions here, his regime, Kristallnacht and the Rome Purge being the two greatest ones. The dead from that were something in the hundreds, probably 300, 400. And I've seen estimates by American historians that he probably had 25,000 people in concentration camps like Dachau. At that point in time, Stalin's victims probably numbered 10 million dead, include 5 to 9 million Ukrainians, all the people Lenin was executing left and right, and Trotsky and these animals were executing and starving, and the democides, as they've been called. And here we ally ourselves with this monster to kill Adolf Hitler. And so, I mean, what was the question? Was it basically which was more evil? They're all evil. But, you know, then you take a look at some of the things, you read some of those statements, Curtis LeMay, about bacon and boiling more Japanese in Tokyo in that one night than were vaporized in Nagasaki and Hiroshima put together. Yay, and I remember being a little kid cheering that stuff, cheering it on. You know, we used to, at the playgrounds, I hate to say it, that's what you called kids you didn't like or you got to fight with, you yellow-bellied Jap. That's the language we use. It was in the comic books. It was in the pages. My parents had that Washington Daily News. I saw it in the bottom drawer, and they put it down there, the newspaper that day. Japs bomb Pearl Harbor. There were a lot of real racial aspect to that war in the Pacific, and the Japanese gave our folks no quarter, and I think some of our folks reciprocated.
Was the Pacific theater a necessary war?
Well, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it was certainly necessary to retaliate and destroy the Japanese fleet, and a lot else followed from it. But there's no question about it that after he was reelected safely, FDR, you know, on the statement, mothers and fathers of America, I've said it before and I shall say it again and again and again, your sons will not be sent into any foreign wars. I think it's October 30th, 1940. He's reelected. Right away, let's start moving Lend-Lease into Britain. Let's send the American Navy out to chase down German submarines in the Atlantic. Let's cut off oil to Japan when they moved into Indochina, even though FDR knew that that would be a cause of war, casus belli. Japanese Prince Kanoya was in power in around September 1940, offered to meet FDR anywhere in the Pacific, including Juneau, Alaska, to settle this. Groove, the American ambassador, said, please do it. The Japanese are ready to get out of Indochina. They'd like America to negotiate a settlement in China, where they've been fighting 4 years. I think we probably could have, could you have avoided the war? Yeah. But the Japanese started it at Pearl Harbor. They did it. They started it, and the Americans were saying, let's get the Japanese to fire the first shot. They did, and it was a big one.
Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, Patrick Buchanan's newest book. Thank you, Mr. Buchanan, for allowing us to come here to your home.
I'm delighted you came over, and I'm delighted with the time, because this is really these two wars, I think, were the mortal blows that may have killed, may prove the mortal blows of Western civilization. After that, the two wars, of course, killed all the great Western empires that ruled the entire world. America emerged, and Bolshevik Russia emerged. And then the Cold War, we exhausted ourselves, and now you take a look at the European countries. Not a single one of them has a birth rate that will allow it to survive in present form through this century. They're being invaded, and they can do nothing, virtually nothing about it, from the Islamic world and Africa. It's changing the culture and dividing their societies. And I think it all goes back to these terrible mortal wounds, these physical wounds that must have killed 150 million civilians, soldiers, the finest of all these nations, destroyed in battle, and the civilians slaughtered in various ways. The Christian West committed suicide, and it's lost its faith, and I think it's headed, frankly, I think it's headed on course to Cafe Terminus.
We'll leave it there.
Next, Book TV visited the Virginia home of Patrick Buchanan for a tour of his book collection. The former presidential advisor and candidate also discusses how he writes books and showed us his gun collection.
Okay, this is the office. As you can see, it's not all fixed up, but these are some of the books. We got them by different categories. For example, these three are basically religious Catholic books on those three shelves, and we've got St. Patrick here, of course, and religious symbols. This is a history of Christianity there. So, but let me take you down here and show you what's in the middle here. These are, incidentally, these are books about presidents of the United States from here. Here, their biographies, some of the most famous you'll find, and right all through these shelves. These are great novels. They're novels I've read.
Pat Buchanan, you work for Richard Nixon.
Sure
Which
did.
is your favorite Richard Nixon biography?
You know, I don't like any of them. They're not very friendly. Well, you know, I hope to do my own memoirs, and I was going to call it With Nixon and Reagan, The Rise and Fall of the American Right. You know, and it might have to be a 2-volume thing. And you know, I've written any number of books. I've written about eight books or something since I've got my editor who came to see me in the Reagan White House, and she had come to see me to sign a contract for me to write my memoirs. I said, we'll get to those after this book, and this book, and this book. So, but these are all, as I say, these are about American history, American presidents, all those right there. This is a sort of a conservative, shelf right here, and a lot of conservative writers, some of the best, and some of my old friends. Sam Francis is in here, Dr. Kirk is here, a lot of them. These books are all basically from my English. I was a major in English in college.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Georgetown University, and I majored in English and a sub-major in philosophy. But these are some of the English books we had there, and I've read all or parts of all of them back from when I went to school, and I still use them. And English really comes in handy. It's all the quotes and stuff. You sort of dress up what you're writing, you know.
What about biographies of Ronald Reagan? What's your favorite?
You know, I haven't spent much time.
Edmund Morris, Dutch?
No, you know, I didn't like him put himself. I mean, I worked with Morris in the White House, and then he put himself in the biography, and I don't think he was at that swimming pool out there in Illinois, you know. But let me see, of these, all these, let me see of the biographies. Let me see.
The Real Reagan by Frank Vanderlinden.
Well, Vanderlinden was a terrific fellow. He's a friend of mine. It's a good book. It's a good small book, but it's not any definitive biography of him. I'll tell you the ones, you know, I like some of the ones of Andrew Jackson, frankly. Marquis James, those are terrific reads. He's a great writer. And frankly, what I most like, and I've got a lot of those upstairs too, but what I most like about biographers, and I'll show you when we get over here, like Gilbert is the definitive biographer of Churchill, but he's just not that great a writer, whereas Manchester is a wonderful writer. And frankly, that's one thing that makes Churchill so impressive. You read Churchill's own writing, and you say, this is marvelous, this is outstanding, and then you read it, you reread it, you study it, and you say, hey, wait a minute. This fellow's changing where he was, and he's doing it in a masterful way. But he's an enormously gifted writer, and that's what makes him sort of so intoxicating a figure. He's a great writer.
I want to ask one more before we leave here.
Sure.
You have Kevin Phillips, American Dynasty book. Are you a friend of Kevin Phillips?
Kevin Phillips and I are old friends from Nixon days, 1968. As a matter of fact, I had a hand in bringing Kevin in. He was a controversial figure to some of the staff. And Kevin came to see me, and he sat down, and we started talking. And I'd been an editorial writer in Missouri, so I knew the politics of Missouri pretty well. And he started describing a 4-county area called Little Dixie and how it had voted in the past. I said, this guy knows a lot more than I do about Missouri. We ought to hire him. I thought he was a terrific asset in 1968. He's really written some terrific books. You know, sometimes he has been completely right when everybody else has been wrong. Not always, but I think that's a great thing to say about an author and a thinker. And I think Phillips has just been terrific. I've got him somewhere here, his famous 1969 book, The New Republican, or the Emerging Republican Majority. Now these books along here, these are sort of philosophy up here. Let me see here.
Jules Whitcover.
Oh yeah,
Jules Whitcover.
Whitcover's an old friend of mine, and I've helped him with one.
You guys don't necessarily agree on much, do you?
Well, let me tell you a funny story about that. Jules was writing a book over there, which I read, called The Resurrection of Richard Nixon. And this book, Jules got a contract for it, and right after Nixon was elected. And so Jules came to see me, and I'm just spilling my guts about all these things we had done and all these things. And so then he came to me a second time. We had a long meeting, and so then we were called to the Roosevelt room, and Haldeman was there. And he said, we've managed to get a look at the advance précis of what Jules Whitcover is going to write in this book. He is going to gut Nixon. We've gotten into it and seen it, so nobody's to talk to him. And I said, Bob, it's a little late for that. I've been talking my head off. So I had to get that out to him. Let me see, these are different things. Yeah, journalism. I went to journalism school, and there's a lot of books, journalism, and some of the columnists that I like. I think Murray Kempton's books are up there, whose I've always been an enormous admirer of. But a lot of those are journalism, just straight books from journalism school. These are the Green Book, the social register for the last 50 years or something, or ever since I got in it.
What's the value of that?
It gives you addresses. No, it gives you addresses of people and things like that if you want to check them out. So let's come on over to here, and those are books there. These are books more of the war. Up top is the war between the states, and these are books, and they include Churchill here. These second two, these are books more about the war and some of the atrocities and things like that. I didn't use these books very much. They got The Court of the Red Tsar, which is a tremendous book. I use that for some anecdotes in there. So yeah, that's it right there. And so in all these things here are things that I usually put around. I just haven't done it. There's a Confederate battle flag if you're interested over there.
Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, Patrick Buchanan's newest book.
Here's where almost all of the books, or I'd say 80% or 90% of the books that I use. Now this shelf
in your research for your latest book?
This latest book. Now this is also a republic, not an empire, because this is the diplomacy in the run-up to all of America's wars. And it's the American side of the quarrel and the argument. Although this, for example, this book, Backdoor to War, also deals with the British side, and so does this. William Henry Chamberlain and I can't think of his name right now. But okay, these are the American side. Here's FDR and Stalin. But these were more for the republic, not an empire. But my book deals with the British Empire. And here's where you start. You start back here in the British Empire. You go back to Salisbury's time, basically, and you come up. I'm sure you'll recognize this Boer War is a fantastic book. Churchill, you know, was involved there. And, of course, Barbara Tuchman is there. You've got Ferguson's Pity of War, which is outstanding.
Who is Barbara Tuchman, and why did you use her so much? You quote her often in your news.
The reason I quote her is she's a phenomenal writer. And she deals in anecdotes and stories that describe characters, and she's been criticized by some professional historians. But I just think as a writer, her Proud Tower, her Guns of August. I remember when I first met Shelley, she invited me out to visit her parents in 1967. And she had a big house on the lake, and I sat out there, and she brought me Bloody Marys all day, and I read The Guns of August. It was July 4th. It doesn't get any better than that. So this is all the Americans. Now, here is as I say, we're down here to the British, and so you come up here to pre-World War I, and then I skip the battles and things, almost all, because, that's not what interests me. What interests me is the diplomacy. And all of these, once you get here, these are some of the best books you will find.
Macmillan,
Paris 1919 is outstanding. There's other books here. Walter Millis's Road to War is outstanding. This is The End of Order. Here it is. This Thomas Fleming. This is not the fellow at Chronicles. It's another fellow he's a wonderful writer. He wrote a book on World War II, too, and he's terrific on it. And there was a new book by David Andelman. Is that here? I fortunately got this one. And I sent him, and I told him, I wrote him a note thanking him. I saw this, he was speaking at AEI and this was just after my book was being handed in almost. And I got this book, and he is terrific on not the breakup of Germany, because I knew plenty about that, but on what was done to Hungary and what was done to Austria after World War I. And the tremendous bitterness and animosity, you see him just handing out people back and forth to different places, and you say they made a dog's breakfast out of Europe. And he describes in detail what was done and how it was done. So this was really, really a useful book. And I wrote him and thanked him. I think I talked to him. I don't know if I talked to him or not, but I wrote him and thanked him because it came right at the end, and I had to start expanding the chapter. One of the problems you got as an author is, it's like a painting. When do I stop? When is this thing finished? And you got to hand this in. Fortunately, if you've been to college, hand the term paper in, Buchanan. It's done. Your deadline is here. And so I read a terrific book. I'm not sure if it's still here on Munich. I'm sure it is. And I read it after. It's by a fellow named Wheeler Bennett in 1948. He's a man of the left, I believe. and very anti-German. But it was a terrific book on Munich and wonderful anecdotes, but I didn't get a chance to get them in there. But let me continue along here. This is, as I say, you move up to Versailles, which is key. Then you get into, this is a biography of David Lloyd George. This is the famous A Peace to End All Peace. It's frankly about the...
David Fromkin.
Yeah, about the Middle East. And this is Wilson's War. Here's the great man's book. As some Brit said, that Winston is writing a biography of himself, and he's calling it The World Crisis.
Would you vote for Winston Churchill if he were around?
I think Winston Churchill was a phenomenal war leader. Undeniably, that period from May 10th of 1940 up through the Battle of Britain, I would say, into the fall, he was a peerless war leader. He was inspirational. He was defiant. He was spitting in the Nazis' face. We're not going to surrender. In the films and movies about that, that's when he immortalized himself. And someone asked him, he said, what year, would you, is the greatest year of your life, or what would you like to live over again? He said, 1940, every time, every time. But then when you move into 42 and you see him going to Moscow and dealing with Stalin, sneaking in there in 1944, and basically, Yalta. Not only Yalta, but even before Yalta, he's in there dividing up Europe, telling Stalin, look, you get 90% of Bulgaria and Romania, we split Yugoslavia. I mean, what's the Atlantic Charter all about? And then he goes to Fulton, Missouri in 1946, say, hey, they got an Iron Curtain across Europe. He's sitting there with Stalin drawing it up. And some of the statements of Stalin, one that really got me was, and I almost couldn't believe it, and I forget exactly my source, but I checked it about 3 times. I think it's the Red Tsar, Court of the Red Tsar. Churchill shows up in Moscow in 42 after the Hitlers invaded Russia. And of course, Churchill was right about Bolshevism in 1919. He was saying we ought to invade, the Allies should take down this regime, kill this snake in its crib. And so he shows up, and he's very nervous because Stalin brings up the fact, you had a lot of nasty things to say about us, Mr. Churchill, 25 years ago. And so Churchill says, can you forgive me? And Stalin said, it is not for me to forgive, it is for God to forgive. I said, that's what I wrote. I just wrote a line after that. This scene is almost unimaginable. But it's those anecdotes, frankly, that I love very much, and you get them in. You just find a way to get them in there, and they're so telling, and and I think they make it a book really readable, which is what I try to do. So you go here. Now this is all Churchill stuff. This is Churchill's. Now these two, now Manchester and what's his name here. Manchester and Gilbert.
Martin Gilbert.
Yeah, I think Gilbert's been sort of critical of Manchester, but one thing Manchester does, Gilbert clearly is the guy who's the ultimate source, but he's not that great a writer. And Manchester is a terrific writer, and unfortunately Manchester had to give up before he finished his 3rd volume. This is a critical biography by Payne, this fellow Payne. A lot of these books, I didn't just read now. I've been reading these books, some of these books for years, when they come out, and I just put them in my library. This is the famous critical book in the 1990s by John Charmley, who said, in effect, people call it now the Charmley line. I was asked by a Newsweek guy, are you taking the Charmley line in this book? And so I said, well, mine's a lot more than that, I'll tell you. So, and both are by Gilbert here. This is terrific, by Roy Jenkins. It's a much more recent book, Sir Roy Jenkins. And here's this Violet Bonham Carter. She was, I believe, that I believe is Asquith's daughter. Anyhow, she was enamored of Churchill her whole life, and it's very, very sympathetic to Churchill. Andrew Roberts is a friend of mine. Let me tell you a little story. One of the things that motivated this book, I went to the funeral of my friend Sir James Goldsmith, who was an individual, they call the Green Mailer, and he's a famous fellow in Britain, and he had an enormously rich billionaire. And he'd been very nice to me, and so I went to the funeral, and Andrew Roberts invited me to his apartment, and with his wife, and he invited Paul Johnson, the historian, and Alan Clark. And I showed up there about 12 with Shelley, and we started off with the champagnes, firing those down, and we had lunch, and we had white wine and red wine, and after dinner liqueurs and drinks. But the whole lunch, I raised the issue, why did you give Poland the war guarantee? And as I recall, Johnson agreed with me, Alan Clark certainly did, and Roberts did not. But I said, why did you do that? And so it was a tremendous argument and debate. And that's one of the motivating things at lunch. I said, I really would like to write about that, because I think that is the fatal blunder that brought down the British Empire. But I remember after it was over, I was just blotto. And so I said, I've got to get going. I wasn't feeling well. I'd been drinking so much. And I walked out into the sunlight, and this blast of sunlight hit me right in the eyes, and I couldn't see. And I think it was Paul Johnson yelled, "Where are you going? We've just started the pre-dinner drinks." That's what the Brits do. But it was very funny, very funny. But I remember that story. And then you got a life of Neville Chamberlain. I mean, I have a different view than folks. I think Neville Chamberlain was more a tragic figure than anything else. And he was not a bad man at all. And I hope I'm fair to him in the book, because, of course, he's made a fool in history, and I suppose...
Peace in our time.
Yeah, peace in our time, but peace in our time, and where did he get the phrase? One of them was from the Anglican Book of Prayer, and the other was from his Austin, his half-brother, who had negotiated the Locarno Pact. And Neville thought he had come home, and he had succeeded in completing his brother's work, The Peace of Europe. And that short statement, I think, of Neville Chamberlain's from 10 Downing Street: "For the second time, a British Prime Minister has come home from Germany with peace, with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." One of the 60 years ago went back to Disraeli, came home from the from the meeting in Berlin, and had said, "I've come home from Germany." And peace for our time, or peace in our time, that is out of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, I think, and it's Austin Chamberlain, the title of his speeches that after he won the Nobel Prize. It's a fascinating story. So he's, let's see, all three. This is a book by Gene Smith, who's sort of a popular writer, and he's got a lot of great stories in here. Of course, this is the 6-volume history of World War II.
When did Winston Churchill write that? 1948?
This is the first one. Gathering Storm was published in 48, and this was published in 1953. So it was a 5-year project. Actually, there's a lot of misspellings in there, but it's, of course, a tremendous read. And in 1949, he got the Man of the Year. I don't think he should have gotten it that year, because Mao Zedong took over China, which seems a little more dramatic than him writing a couple of books. So, but and some of these here these are very old books. Oh, this is really an interesting one. This is where this is step by step. These are columns that Winston Churchill himself wrote every 2 weeks between 1936 and 1939. And in here, and in Great Contemporaries, which is another book which he published in 37, he has a number of complimentary things to say. This is a much earlier version. In these two books, he's got these little markers are where I get the clips. He's got a number of complimentary things to say about Adolf Hitler. And the astonishing one is after Munich. After Munich, he denounced Munich, what a horrible deal it was, on the 5th of October, which was after Munich. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if I can go to the 4th of October. I used a lot of these quotes. Where we are, German maneuvers. Data somewhere in here. Let's get the date. Oh, October 20th, 1938. It would be right before that. Oh, here we are. Look at this. Now, this is written. What's the date of this? Let's see here. Okay, this is October 4th.
1938.
1938. Munich, September 30th. Chamberlain comes home. Here's Churchill writing about the Munich Agreement. France after Munich. Here's the last paragraph. "It is a crime to despair. We must learn to draw from misfortune the means of future strength. There must not be lacking in our leadership something of the spirit of that Austrian corporal who, when all had fallen into ruins about him and when Germany seemed to have sunk forever into chaos, did not hesitate to march forth against the vast array of victorious nations and has already turned the tables so decisively upon them. It is the hour not for despair but for courage and rebuilding." So, and that is the spirit which should rule our minds. You don't think of Churchill as talking about the martial spirit of the Austrian corporal. So, but those are really terrific. We got some terrific quotes from Churchill in here. that somewhat contradict the image he paints of himself in these books. You go back and you read what he was doing and saying. He rewrites history in all these cases to say, what did the Americans drive us to break the treaty with Japan for? And he was in favor of it himself. He didn't stand up against it. And a number of other occasions you find Churchill rewriting history to his own benefit. And the really unfair one, when he really charges Chamberlain, it's a great passage where he says, how in heaven's name could we honor this guarantee? I mean, it's what a rash act it appears to have been to have made it at that time when everything was against us. He was the main guy pushing Chamberlain to do it back in 1939. So he was not without duplicity. But that's so let me go down here. These are all, some of these are very critical. They're almost out of print. They're very critical of Churchill, some of those histories. But I will say this, these were very courageous writers, some of these folks, because they wrote those right after the war when Churchill, and they're Brits, right after the war when Churchill was a great hero to everybody. Now here's the German, this is the German history. This runs all the way back from before the Kaiser. You've got Bismarck in here, and you move up to the Kaiser, and there, that's Mein Kampf itself, Hitler's book. You know, I first got a copy of that when I was 13 in a Loudermilk bookstore. It was just sitting there, you know.
13,
and,
what year was that?
Probably 1951. I don't know if that's the original. I think my brother took it. He was bigger than I was and kept it. But I've got, that's the Mein Kampf that was published in the United States.
Why did you buy that when you were 13 years old?
Because it was fascinating. You know, here's the Mein Kampf, the World War is over, and here's the Hitler's own book, and you had heard about all these things, and it was sitting there, and Loudermilk's was an old bookstore, and we used to go down there and buy sports magazines and cut out the pictures, because they're big color portraits. They're magnificent. You know, it was like a portrait gallery. You had of all these great ball players. But we bought that down there. But you got other biographies. There's Bullock's biography of Hitler. There's the 2-volume biography by Ian Kershaw, which is very modern. This is a fascinating book. It's called Hitler's Table Talk, and it's introduced by Roper, the British historian. And I read it through, and I am just, it's Hitler talking right after he's at conversations, he's on trains, and he's talking constantly, and there's different people in there with him, the general staff, foreign minister, others, and someone is there taking notes, and they transcribe all the notes, and it is just a fascinating study of Hitler, and I mean, he's a much more mature figure than you'll find. Mein Kampf is a horrible, I mean, just from the standpoint, it's not simply it's anti-Semitic all the way through, but it's in desperate need of some editor to organize the thing. You know, you're here and you're going back there, and it's it just is a generally bad book. This, of course, Shire's famous book. This is the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. This is the Rise and Fall of the Third Republic. But basically, this is all about Germany, Nazi Germany, and Hitler's biography and what his objectives were, and diplomatic. And right below there, if you can put that down there, that's Mussolini. I must have 4 or 5 biographies of Mussolini. And then there's a number of people talk about that Stresa conference, which is the one focus. Let me say something that you know, for me, this was, I mean, I was educating myself. For example, I was aware, we were kids, we studied the Washington Naval Conference and all those things. We had good history in parochial schools, but the idea that the British were that close to the Japanese, and the Japanese had been that supportive in World War I, and what the Japanese demanded at Versailles, and how the Americans pushed the British into tearing apart an alliance with Japan. I mean, Japan was not a benevolent power, but it had worked. And to tear the thing apart meant to alienate Japan, isolate them, move them outside the community of nations, whereas the British, because they were the Brits, and the Japanese admired them enormously as an island empire, they had a great moral influence on the Japanese and a restraining influence on the Japanese. And the Americans forced them to break the alliance. And to me, I mean, that's why I admire Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia. He was a gutsy guy. He said, what are we doing? To get the Americans telling us how to run the empire? And he had sassed Wilson to his face at Versailles. Wilson had said, when the Australians wanted some more of the islands in the South Pacific that the Japanese had taken and they had taken from the Germans. And Wilson didn't want them to have them. And he said, Mr. Hughes, are you going to destroy the hopes and dreams of the world over a couple of islands? And Hughes said, and he turned up his earpiece, he said, That's about the size of it, Mr. President. He's a man after your own heart.
We're in Pat Buchanan's office here
Right.
at his home, looking at his
Yeah.
library.
So let's move through that's all the Germans and that's the Italians and the French down there. Ernest May, the Harvard historian, has written about one of the best books, and also what's his name, Alistair Horn, and Ernest May and Alistair Horn. I sent when I finished the book, I sent notes to all these historians, and I sent them copies of the book that I could find, because I wanted to say thanks, since I've quoted you an awful lot. And I got a nice note back from him. He was apparently a roommate of William F. Buckley's, but he wrote wrote about the fall of France, and so did Ernest May, and they're just wonderful histories. I mean, Americans have some great, and the Brits have some wonderful historians. Even, you can spot some people that got a point of view and discount that, but they're just, we've got some great historians. I mean, both countries do. Now, these are general histories of the British Empire, and even one of them is entitled that, the British Empire, by the best of the British. This is terrific. This is by Massey, Dreadnought. That's over 1,000 pages. Many of these are best-selling books. Here's Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy.
And what is Dreadnought about?
Dreadnought's about the march to war between Germany and Great Britain from about the 1890s up to 1914. Dreadnought is about, the title of it's taken from the tremendous new battleships that were superior to all the battleships in the world that the British introduced. Fisher did, Admiral Sir John Fisher did around 1906. And these battleships were so powerful that they made all the other ships obsolete, all the other battleships, because they could stay off further, fire heavier shells, and had greater armor and greater speed. So it was, they could slaughter everything on the high seas. And so the Brits started building, and so Tirpitz, Admiral Tirpitz, they immediately start building. And so the British started building 2 and 4 a year. And so, and Churchill was just before he was first Lord of the Admiralty. He was very anti-military in a lot of ways, because I think he was for cutting the military and things. And he got up and said, look, the one side of the House, the Liberals, we wanted 4 dreadnoughts, and the Tories wanted 6, and so we settled for 8. Yeah, that's another thing that makes Churchill so impressive is the anecdotes, the quotes, and the brilliant lines and things.
I see John Lucas up here. Have you picked up his new book?
Yes, I think it's here. Isn't that? Well, let's see. Which one is that?
Blood, Toil, Sweat, and Tears, I believe.
Yeah, I think that should probably. Is that in here?
Don't see it.
Here's his 5 days in May. He wrote a very critical review, but I don't know that I've read the latest. I don't think I've read the latest, but I've read a number of them. This is his biography of Kennan.
What are you reading right now, Pat?
But I think I mentioned that I'm very interested in writing about racial conflict. Both Arthur Schlesinger and Pat Moynihan said in the 1990s, the wars of ideology are going to give way to the wars of race. And it was sort of a profound statement. And then I read this piece in it's over here in one of those piles on the left, I think, in the Foreign Affairs, about this idea of what's coming ahead as the Western Empire, the European nations clearly recede, and in terms of population we diminish. And you see these conflicts in Kenya, you see them in Bolivia, you see them in Rhodesia, you see them everywhere, conflicts of religion, tribe, and race, rather than ideology, rather than fascism, democracy, Bolshevism, and all the rest of it. And you see these things emerging. And so it is, what is the unifying principle? It can keep the world unified. Is democratic capitalism succeeding? That's the American objective, to make the whole world democratic capitalist, end of history and all that. And I think that tide is sort of receding. And you see it even in our politics. Issues of race and ethnicity constantly coming to the fore and broiling us every day. So it could be a very tough future, but I thought of just sitting down and writing about that, and writing about and then getting into the history of the stuff, which I really enjoy.
Is this where you write?
This is the monster. Yeah, this is, we write right in.
That's an old school screen.
No, it's brand new to me.
Well, they make the flat screens now, just this
yeah,
one.
Okay, well, this is a monster, though. This is what I need. I get my head up a couple inches from it. These are very old computers. This is the newest. It's probably about 6 years old. This might be 10. you know, and this is basically, it doesn't work anymore, but I occasionally put everything in here to back it up. You got your printer and you got your fax. Let me show you how you write this. You know, I would be reading in a book at the bedstand, say, let's take one of these books here, and let's take that big one, Dreadnought. You'd be reading something, okay, and so what you do is you put this, when you're reading it, put a little tag right here by it, it's underlined, and so then you come down here in the morning, and you take that the quotation, and you come over here and you write 2 or 3 paragraphs around it, and then you take it and put it into the text in the machine, and you take this over here, and you Xerox this page, and you Xerox with it the cover page so they know where it's from. Okay? So you Xerox this and staple the two together. Let me show you in here. And once you get those stapled, you put it in here. Let's take the chapter. This is August 1914. Okay, this is from Hillgruber's book, Germany and the Two World Wars, translated by William Kirby. And you've got here, you put that here and you staple these together, and you put these, the ones you use, I've got obviously 3 or 4 quotes in here I use, and I mark them in green. Then I put them in the files, and I send the files. My buddy comes down, he's a PhD from Maryland, Frank Mintz. He comes down and he picks up the files, or I will send them by mail, and you'll put those things in the files, and then he double checks to make sure I got all the punctuation exact, got the quotes exact, and then he'll send me back, and I'll send him also the Xerox copy of the thing, and he makes all these corrections, and I'll put the corrections in the machine and freeze them there, then I'll send them back again. And you keep doing that, and he's been coming down for a couple of years, you know, on Saturdays, say once a month, and we'll sit there and he'll say, you know, I just read a biography of Ribbentrop, and he tends to agree with so-and-so, and just wonderful. You sit here for a couple of hours talking about this, talking about all this. It was just, I mean, frankly, I hated to give the book up. It was so much fun to write and work on. It was like, you know, I think I've compared it to writing a book, a history book, to a painting. At some point, you got to say, we're done. It's over. Turn the paper in. But then you find some other quote. You find information like Bill Bullitt, famous. I didn't know he'd walked out of Versailles, and he was a young guy as a part of the delegation. And I would have gotten that in and gotten his quote in. You know, hey, he was angry too, and you know, and strengthened the argument. So it's that's how it's all.
Do you do all your own typing and filing and?
I do all the typing, and I file them all here. But then I give him these files. Eventually, I send the files up to him, and I send by mail these things when I come down at night and clip them all together. I'll get a pile of them, and I'll send them, and I'll indicate what chapter file they're to go in, and I'll send up the new printed copy of the chapter and say, check all these, you know. So here, you see you got the chapter titles here, Versailles and Saint-Germain. The Anglo-Japanese Treaty is the title there. Look at this. Must be 200 footnotes here, backup. Some of these footnotes, you know, don't have just one source. Some of them got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because you'll find these guys are all trading the same footnotes. They're all doing the same. And I'll tell you, I'm much better than they are, because after you do the footnotes, I start reading the stuff. I say, wait a minute, that guy misquoted it. It's inexact, you know. And you can, and we've been working on this so long that a lot of things pop up from these fellows.
Do you write in the morning or when?
Well, you know, on the book, mainly I write at night, and I get up in the middle of the night. I read these books, and then I put the little tabs on, and I'll wake up at 3, and I'll say, let me get downstairs and get it into the machine. And you come down here, and you'll spend maybe 3 hours working on 4 or 5 paragraphs. You get in, you rewrite it, rework it, then you put it into the copy, and you move the copy around, and you say, perfect. And you go back to bed and sleep like a baby. Okay. One more thing over here.
We'll add one more thing to the book here.
This is the Buchanan gun collection. These all the guns have some historical value. Let me just show you, before I show you the Germans and British ones. Here's one of my favorites. This is the Buntline Special. This is the gun that Ned Buntline gave one to Bat Masterson and one to Wyatt Earp. And he claimed that Wyatt Earp used this to smack McClary over the head in the bar that caused McClary to go get the Clantons and bring them to the OK Corral. But I've been watching the movies, and I can't find them using a gun like this. But
is that the original? Or
no, this isn't the original. There are only 5 made. The original probably cost $1 million. and we're not quite that affluent, but this is expensive enough. But this is a Mauser just like the one Churchill used in the Boer War. This is a famous Mauser pistol. The Bolsheviks carried them also. They're, you know, they're Mausers and their leather coats. And I understand 1965 they found a Mauser in South Africa with WSC initials on it. They claimed it was Churchill's. He had lost it when he was captured by Botha's forces, you know, in that armored train incident. This is, and over here are the German weapons, some of the German weapons. This is the, let's see, this is the, yeah, this is, it looks like a Luger, but this is a P-38. This is the exact model of the weapon Erwin Rommel carried as a sidearm in the Desert Fox. This one here is a classic Luger. It's the von Richthofen, the Baron von Richthofen Luger. That's a beauty. That is really a beauty. There's the Blue Max.
And again, Pat Buchanan, are these replicas?
These are actual weapons. Well, some of them are replicas, and some of them are actual Lugers from that era. None of them, I mean, this obviously, I don't have von Richthofen's own Luger, but it's an exact replica. Some of them are just cleaned up versions of old weapons. Some are brand new. This is the, take a look at the one behind that. That is a Steyr. That's an Austrian-made weapon, which is the sidearm of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And that was made, it's an Austrian-built weapon. And that's the one that the one he carried, obviously ceremonially. He didn't do any fighting. He never fought in a war. And this is the Walther. It's very similar to the James Bond Walther, but this is a model of the Iron Cross Walther, which was used by German officers in World War II. But we got a lot of other American ones and Confederate weapons. And
Why?
I mean, they're all historical value, and I love the looks of them, you know, and they have something to say. They all have some meaning behind them. I thought of writing a book of the guns and the history of them and what they meant. This, for example, is a Confederate weapon. It is an amazing weapon. Confederates weren't able. It's a Thomas Jonathan Jackson Lamat revolver. You can hold that. See this thing. You know what it is? See, it came out there. Let's see. This thing is. It's a 60 caliber shotgun underneath, which is a shotgun. At the same time, it's got a, I think it's about nine. It's nine. It can fire nine bullets. You have to work the hammer here, but the Confederate cavalry used it, and the first shot will fire both the shotgun and one bullet, and then you take it around and fire the various bullets. And as I said, if you fired all 9 rounds and they're still coming, get out of there. But it's the reason you got this, it's Lamat. The Confederates didn't have any real armories to build their own, so I think this is a French-built weapon, and it's what they carried around with them. The cavalry. Stewart, I got one for my little brother. It's a Jeb Stewart version of the same revolver. So, yeah, and I thought of writing a book on the guns and the history around all of them. You know, write a story. See, there's a real myth. People say that story was made up about the Buntline special. Ned Buntline faked it. And just write the whole story about whether it was faked. Is it true? Here's the Buntline special. He sent them out. Was this guy lying and all this? But write the whole story about him, about each of these guns. I've got patents, revolvers there, and everything.
Okay, so you've talked about writing your memoirs. You've talked about writing a history of guns. You've talked about the racial wars. Any other? Which is coming next? And any other ideas for books?
No other ideas for books. It might be the one on the racial wars, racial and ethnic conflicts, internally and externally. But it might be the memoirs, you know. But memoirs take a long time. No, I haven't really. I tell you, folks, if there's not a documentary, a movie company has come to see me about Reykjavik, and I've got a lot of notes from Reykjavik, you know, and the folks they've talked to already, none of them were on the plane with Reagan, or in the room with him at the, and you got a photo up there in the den where I was in the room with him giving notes. See, we got a new speech, sir.
You were there between Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it was Schultz.
Reagan.
Schultz did not. Yeah, Reagan. Schultz did not. See, Schultz stayed. He didn't come home on the plane with Reagan. We did. We came home with Reagan and Poindexter and Tony Dolan. And so I've got a lot of a lot of memories that those folks don't have.
Now, does Shelley, Mrs. Buchanan, help you at all in your
Oh,
writing?
yeah, Shelley
or
does.
editing, or-
Well, not in the writing and editing, because now, you can do it all by machine, but she handles the schedule and a lot of the publicity and the communications with the folks in New York and all the communications with the folks for MSNBC and everything. And so I just let the phone ring and don't answer it.
And just very quickly, what is her background for people who might not know?
Shelley got out of the University of Michigan and went to work in New York, but somebody said, why don't you come down and look around Washington? And she had taken a job, I think, at Time. And she came down and went for an interview and got a job with the Vice President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon, 18 months before the November election. And she traveled with him and the entire campaign of 1960. And the office across the hall from Nixon's was John F. Kennedy's, and Pamela Tennur was over there. And she was friends with all the gals at the Kennedy. She said, we did come to a point where we weren't talking to each other anymore. But Kennedy, she used to come in and she used to tell me that all the girls would come out in the hall to see young Teddy Kennedy, who was probably 26, 27 years old, walk down the hall, a long, long time ago. And that's where I met her up in 67. She was with Nixon's 60 campaign. In 62, in California, she worked for H.R. Haldeman. 64, she traveled in a small F-27 for the Goldwater campaign, where Nixon, I think, worked harder for Goldwater than Goldwater did for himself. And then she left, and by the time she came back to Nixon in 67 for the 68 run, I'd been there about 18 months.
Pat Buchanan, thanks for the tour of your library.
Well, thanks. This is the old office, and I'm sorry it doesn't look a little better for you guys. A little bit things messed up here.
Pat Buchanan's most recent book is Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. To learn more about his books, visit buchanan.org.